Salve te omnes, I am Ruminus, and today we are doing a review for Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars. I know it's been a while since I've played this and beaten this on my channel, but things got away from me, things happened, alright? It took a long time. Some of the footage is lost, so we're gonna have to deal with that. It may not be exactly on screen what I'm talking about, but it's there, whatever. So Super Mario RPG starts off like every other Mario game. Princess Toadstool gets captured, Bowser doesn't respect boundaries, and giant swords come out of the sky. We rescue Peach in the tutorial, but a giant sword decides to rock the world and send everybody flying, whereupon we begin our search for Toadstool again. Our original purpose is to save Toadstool, but we make some friends along the way and have some important side quests. We help a Cloud friend find his family, help a Star friend rebuild the space bridge, and help Bowser murder some things. We quickly learn that the sword is from a greater threat than the Dragon Turtle, so we set off to put him in timeout. The game is a turn-based RPG with a decent amount of secrets, so the time to beat will likely depend on the type of player. To go through the main game will take about 20 hours or so, and actually require little to no grinding. If the player fights everything in the path, they will get to level 30 by the end of the game, although you don't need to be maxed out to beat the final boss. The game has consistent controls with jumping, walking, running, and interacting with things in the real world, and also the menus mapped to each button for the fight world. When I pressed buttons, they buttoned. There wasn't a time where there was an issue where the game did not listen to my inputs. The time reactions for each verb in battle happens every time without fail. The game is turn-based, so the player can't cancel any actions. Due to the mechanics of the game, this is not an issue, as you have all the time in the world to think before you do something in the fights. The game allows immediate repeating of actions in the real world, which is helpful for the jumps and the platforming, but the player has to wait until the game cycles each enemy before launching another attack in the fights. Obviously, the timed reactions often have long windows of opportunity, so the player does not have to be extremely precise or accurate to set them off. Each level is crafted so that the falls and failed platforming will often take a slight walk to reset, which really isn't punishing or annoying, since the jumps are often not hard. There will be a few, but those are not required and thus are a risk versus reward opportunity. Later in the game, some areas will have lava or chompy plants that will send Mario to the start of the area, but the player can immediately retry without taking time to reset or move. The game has no built-in latency for the controls. The actions all respond immediately, even when skipping the menus in the fights. The player can spam buttons and speed through without any issues or delays or pauses between actions. Each action is used frequently throughout the game. Most areas have a plethora of fights, of platforming, of NPCs for interacting and gaining items. In fights, the player can choose to use regular attacks, special attacks, items, or defense. I personally never really use defense, but some players may have a use for it. Despite this, the game gives plenty of opportunity for each type of attack to be used. In the real world, there are plenty of shops, landmarks, NPCs, and so on for interacting and learning about the world, plenty of ledges and slopes for jumping, and pipes for teleportation. Each of the actions is considerably useful. Running and jumping help traverse the land, complete puzzles, and find secrets. Each verb for fighting has a very particular purpose. Defense defends, special attacks are useful for strong enemies, some bosses, crowds, and regular attacks are your regular standard for any enemy, and items do help for both defense and offense. The game gives strong autonomy to the player for a vast majority of the game. There are some cutscenes that will take the camera, stop movement, or force the player into a situation, but these impediments are quick and very rare. The game moves quickly enough that the player can race through areas within about 10 seconds, getting from one end of a region to the next in the overworld in about a minute, if every fight is avoided. The movement in fights is slower, but the enemy's attacks are slow enough to recognize the telegraph, yet fast enough to not make the game take an eternity with the mass murder we need to do to level up. The game is an isometric style with a fixed camera on the player. The view is wide enough to see the surrounding areas so that ambushes can't happen, but the player can see any obstacles or hazards from afar. The details on the models and environment can be seen clearly, and it is easy to tell apart the foreground and background. The secret hills and jumps are seen clearly, giving the player a cue that there is a method to get up there, so start jumping with the fury of a volcano. The game grows in terms of difficulty, scope and story, abilities, and party members throughout the game. The enemies will gain more health, deal more damage, and attack in larger groups, making it disadvantageous to skip many fights, but advantageous to fight the larger groups. The enemies, items, and equipment will improve and vary as the player gets to new areas, giving uniquity and choice to the player, as some will choose the strong items, others will go for immunity to status effects, others will forget entirely to equip and wonder why the game is savage. The story starts small and familiar to the series, then reveals a greater disaster about 25% of the way in. The story also keeps some of the small scale while saving the towns and the people, while reminding the player about the Smith God trying to steal the stars. The growth is generally the same for the most part, but will switch up the status quo for uniquity. Like for the Power Wranglers who steal the star, which we quickly get back, and Bowser's Keep 2, Volcanic Boogaloo, where we have to complete a large area of puzzles, fights, and impossible quizzes. I didn't become a teacher to learn things, man. Stop asking me questions. The game flows very linearly and very reasonably. Leveling up characters requires more experience each time, but the enemies will also generally give a proportional amount of XP in the new areas, so leveling doesn't take too long. The enemies improve as well, but not so much that they are ever impossible to beat so long as the player fights a decent chunk in each region. The levels themselves start with flat lands, but then slowly grow into platforming for secrets or items, then into requirements in platforming to navigate the new areas. It slowly amps up the movement each time to get the player used to the controls. The story also grows each time and keeps the sense of scale and uncertainty. The plot is revealed little by little as Mario punches everything in existence and slowly ramps up the severity as we learn why things are happening. The game has a medium difficulty. Because it is an RPG, there will be some grinding and the player needs to remember to buy and equip new items, otherwise these stupid bee things will sting you into the next dimension. The latter half of the game requires the player to pay attention to each squad mate's unique abilities, as the enemies will do status effects, insta-kills, recover their own health, area of effect attacks, and things along those lines. If the player tries to only use regular attacks, the game will drag on because the squad mates will start to die, and the player falls into a cycle of healing one teammate just for the next attack to kill the other teammate, and they're back in that same cycle. The game is sustainable for its entire playthrough. The levels, enemies, bosses, and puzzles are varied enough to make each one unique. The story is intriguing enough, although pretty standard for a Mario game. The attacks are quick enough with nice animations, the music is straight fire, and there's plenty of secrets to make investigations useful. The flow is consistent and fast enough to keep it interesting, and the movement is quick enough to make backtracking not really a chore. The game has plenty of replay value and endgame value in using different items, setting personal challenges, speedruns, getting all the secrets, and things along that nature. The game starts with a general princess napping storyline, although ditches that pretty much immediately when the heavens split open and Excalibur decides to take over Bowser's castle. While looking for Toadstool after the Corona Mario ejection, we find friends with unique backstories, find enemies with unique attacks, and giant stars that we hurl back into the heavens. Get that garbage out of here! We soon learn that the Star Road is broken and we need to fix it or die trying. We then learn that this was all a plot for some trans-dimensional Santa Claus to take over our world, and we need to convince him to retire violently. The story itself is riddled with jokes, goofs, gaffes, jestings, and general frivolity. It is lighthearted and doesn't take itself too seriously, since it would be hard to have a super dramatic story while Peach slaps robots into pieces. The music for this game is some smooth marble. It is 8-bit and made of loops that repeat after about 30 seconds to a minute, but every song is jamming. Listen to this. Now this. How about this? Then there's this. The music is very cartoonish and catchy, which is fitting for the theme and setting of the game. The music is tailored for the setting and the story, where sad moments are sad, the tunnels are scary, and the bosses are intense. However, the music is always excessive in the melody, keeping with the idea that this isn't real or too serious. The sounds, likewise, keep with the theme and setting. They're often cartoonish, over-exaggerated, and they pop. But they're unique, and they're not too loud, and they don't clash with each other, and they're very nice, and I think it fits very well with the game. The game's mechanics are quite reliable throughout the journey. Each area will have slightly stronger enemies, the bosses will require the player to interact with them to start the battle, new equipment will always be better than old ones. The game teaches the base mechanics of the game within about 10 minutes, and keeps to them for the rest of the game. Adding more along the way, but always in a safe environment, will not frustrate the player. The end level of the game is a boss rush and caused 2 of my deaths because the status effects were far too devastating than ever before, and the minions were capable of untold destruction than ever before. Other than that, the game kept to a pattern for its mechanics and never felt unfair or untrustworthy. The game has a fair amount of manipulatives for both the player and the enemies. There are stats for defense, offense, special attacks, and special defense, and also luck. These can all be altered with temporary items in battle or equipment outside of it. There are also special moves that increase or decrease stats, which the enemies love to use, because apparently they don't want to die for some stupid reason. The player also has a selection of 4 squad mates, as Mario has to be in the party at all times, which changes the focus of the fights based on their unique skills and stats. All of these manipulatives serve to alter the difficulty of the game and help with growth. The game implements a fair amount of assistance as well. The luck stat helps with the player getting free items in battle, which can be vital in the more difficult fights. When the player dies, they actually get to keep all the experience they gained, which not only limits the frustration of losing progress, but also makes it easier to level up or get back to where they were before they died. There are random gamble games for doubling coins or experience, and there are plenty of mini games for getting the frog coins, which buy the best items in the game. Running away from a battle will make the enemy intangible for a brief period, which prevents the issue of escaping a battle just to get sucked back into it. There is an invincible star in many regions, which help the speed of leveling up and progressing in the game, and there are plenty of inns, recovery mushrooms, flower upgrades, which also restore all flower power / special attack juice. The game gives a lot of help to the player if they want to use it. Defeating a boss will restore all health and flower power as well, preventing the need for recovering or spending money after these brutal fights. The game is fairly lenient and helpful to the player, making the game easy if the player recognizes all the help that they are getting. The game also has some detrimental mechanics, but they are not overbearing. There are plenty of status effects to limit the player's movement, verbs, items, and will to live. One of the bosses in particular will completely disable a fighting action, another will steal all items for the remainder of the fight. Physical hazards and drops in the real world will cause the player to start the platforming over, and the puzzles and Bowser's Keep are all limited in the amount of retries that you can do before having to do the whole thing over again. Some enemies can only really be hurt by normal attacks, others by special attacks, but all except bosses can be fled in the event that the player is out of flower power. These detriments can be a nuisance, especially for the mushroom effect, as it completely blocks all fighting verbs, but they are not too frequent, invasive, or limiting that they should cause great frustration. The game has a fair amount of guiding mechanics to help move the player along in the new areas or in the fights. The levels are very straightforward, very rarely having multiple pathways, and when they do, they circle back to the main path eventually. In the more open areas, there are dirt lines to signify where to go, and floating boxes or enemies to help orient the player when going through pipes. The levels are colorful, which helps contrast the painting, notes, and signs against the foreground and background. Enemies that only use special attacks will often have high resistance to special attacks, and large groups will often be easy prey for special attacks or ones with large area of effect. The tall ledges and suspicious doors will alert the player that there's a secret nearby, such as the slight amount of window in the ship area showing that there is a door hidden behind the debris. There are plenty of secrets that have to be known, and I've never gotten anywhere near all the invisible boxes, but this is intentional to make the player explore the world, and going back through areas is not necessarily difficult, but I find it to be annoying even back in the day when I had all the time in the world to jump around town like a lunatic. The tutorial teaches the base aspects of mechanics intuitively at first, then goes into explicit teaching for younger players, or those who didn't understand what was going on. These direct teachings can also be ignored for the most part and are not extensive when the player reads them. Even still, there are plenty of hidden mechanics or controls that the player has to deduce. Timed hits are taught for regular attacks, but never for defense or special attacks. But the player should be able to guess or try to see if these work and realize that they indeed do. I always tried it for items as well to get freebies, but it was never consistent, and I don't think it actually works for the items. There's one area with a small gap and a coin on the other side, with no other path to get there, so the player has to guess that they can duck if they press down while moving. Each squad mate has innate specialties, where Mallow is useful for special attacks or Bowser for raw damage, and the player must test out the teammates personally to figure this out. The game does give explicit instruction for the most part, but does have enough hidden aspects that the player is encouraged to play around. The game is mostly entwined with its goofy theme and the previous titles in the series, although doesn't really have any sense of consistency. Mushrooms heal the player, Mario jumps 15 feet easily, Bowser's a punk, and the levels all have inexplicable difference in biomes while being so close to each other, even though that would cause great destruction, devastation, and natural disasters. However, why some enemies get pummeled into coins and permanently die while others survive is odd, why flowers grant me the ability to conjure lightning, why Jinx can fry my potato wedges with ease but doesn't help me save the world, doesn't really make sense. The real reason is that it's a Mario game, and it's supposed to be goofy, but they could have made it so that every enemy returned at some point, or gave a reason why the best fighters in the world are not helping me save the world. The tutorial starts off very well with pure implicit teaching, but quickly devolves into explicit. The very beginning has Mario running through Bowser's Keep, where the player learns that the fights are not random, but caused by walking into enemies, that fights are turn-based, that each button in a fight has a specific use. Likely, that they can run, that some fights are unavoidable, and that they can choose which enemy to attack in a fight. Once the fight with Bowser starts, everything is overtly explained, although some of it can be skipped. When going to the Mushroom Kingdom, the player can choose to help Toad, who will then explain the aspects of mechanics more. more. This teaches implicitly that Mario can help people for rewards, but explicitly that helping people is annoying. Overall, the tutorial is a mixed bag. Although I like that they leaned in first with implicit, I don't like how much of the explicit has to be skipped through instead of the player just being told about training and having to go ask for it by a certain character. These explanations are simple and concise, so it's not a heinous thing. It's not terrible, but it could have been improved. The UI UX is well designed for the game. The options in the menu are concise and make sense. If you need to find an item, setting, or party member, it's easy to find it. There's enough spacing between the options and save slots to not get confused. The text is large enough with a cream background so that it never really gets obscured. Some text is a simple bright white, but it is rare, and most backgrounds are contrasted against it. The colors and shadows are clear enough to tell the difference between the foreground and the background. Larger enemies are clearly bosses, and regular enemies move around to make them more easily noticeable. Everything is easy to navigate and digest at an instant. The graphics, for the time, were supreme. For a SNES title, 3D was rare, but the models and the design are actually good looking. Despite its age, the graphics still hold up. The game has a cartoonish and saturated style where environments and characters have bright, various colors and will often be ridiculous sizes or proportions. Nothing seems uncanny or out of place, but the irregular proportions help fit with the theme of a magical world, whereas it's often easier to just impersonate others than use your voice. I mean, why would you ever use your voice if you could do things like this? The game, considering its age, has a decent amount of accessibility. The vibrant, contrasting colors will help colorblind people tell the different items apart. The text is always against a light background and is large enough in size, although the font may not be fitting for those with dyslexia. There are platforming sections which can be rough for those with spatial issues, and some events are timed or limited in attempts, which can cause stress in a game that otherwise encourages people to take their time. However, failing these events does not cause a game over, and retrying is allowed, so some stress should be mitigated once this is realized. But the timing can still be a problem for those that struggle with processing or reaction. For a final score, I give the gameplay a 35 out of 35, the story a 4 out of 5, sound 5 out of 5, mechanics 25 out of 30, the tutorial a 4 out of 5, the UI UX a 5 out of 5, the visuals a 5 out of 5, and accessibility a 5 out of 5. Overall, I give the game a 5 out of 5. Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars is a fan favorite for many for good reason. It is a funny, goofy Mario game that has interesting attacks, enemies, and environments. The story is pretty generic, but the characters are unique, and Geno is a rainbow god of death. The man shoots stars from his hands. Even though it is turn-based, it encourages engagement by having timed events in the battles and moves fast enough that the battles don't become obnoxious. The battles can also be skipped, as they are not random encounters, which often slow the game way down, and the stats are simplistic enough that it doesn't require any sort of planning or min-maxing. The music is absolutely banging, and there are plenty of secrets for continued playthroughs. Thanks everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified of future videos. But until next time, wale te omnes.